Dr. Finn first, latest casualty estimate stands at 79, a very high toll. And in a conservative borough, how much of a knock-on effect do you think this is going to have on Prime Minister Theresa May?
I think it's already had a significant effect on her. I think that following so soon after an election campaign where she was largely regarded as very impersonal, very aloof, unwilling to meet the public, her response to the disaster was initially characterised as very out of touch. You know, initially she refused to meet the residents in public view. The leader of the opposition, Jeremy Corbyn, did meet them, and she was criticised by a former Conservative Cabinet Minister, Michael Portillo, the other evening as just not displaying basic humanity. So within that narrative that's begun to form around Theresa May is kind of cold and distant, the response, rather than the fire itself, the response to the fire has created significant problems for her.
Professor Brooks, what do you think are the possible reasons behind her apparent indifference towards the suffering of the victims? I mean, she could have done something different this time right after the fire, for instance.
Yeah, well, I think the main problem that the Prime Minister has at the moment is that she is still in her ill-judged campaign mode. So during her election campaign, only recently ended, she was called by some Maybot that she sounded like a robot saying, "I'm going to be strong and stable leadership again and again and again." But one of the things that turned off some voters was they didn't see much that was strong and stable, and we're certainly not seeing anything like that now, whether it be on this disaster, the terrorist attack this morning, or leading into the Brexit negotiations. Strong and stable are not two words that we'd assign to her. And I think that her campaign strategy of having being surrounded only by select groups of supporters for some very good kind of photo ops that were fairly vacuous and light. I think she needs to get out of campaign mode fast. The election is over. She lost her majority but remains the leader of the largest party. And it's not just Jeremy Corbyn who is upstaging her. The Queen was out meeting victims the other day. It seems that everyone seems to be doing this better than she is. The Prime Minister can't stop things like this from happening, perhaps. But the real leadership is what happens afterwards, and there she's really failed on all measures.
Yeah, Dr. Finn, do you think Prime Minister May has reacted better after the Finsbury Park van attack this time? I mean, she immediately called an emergency meeting. Do you think she has learned from her mistakes after the fire?
Well, I think it's hard for her to do worse. I can only echo Tom's sentiments, really. You know, she's been stuck in this robotic mode where essentially she has only been prepared to give pre-scripted answers to questions, even if they weren't the questions she was actually asked. So I think the performance today, in light of, as you mentioned, calling an emergency meeting, in some senses, these are the kinds of things the Prime Ministers always do. When there's a terrorist attack, the Cobra Committee is called to meet. Essentially, an emergency meeting has been called today. She's, made known that she considers it to be a terrorist attack, which was something the police were criticised for in the early hours of this morning because they weren't clear on that. So she has made some moves today, but frankly, she's got a huge hill to climb. You know, she has done an enormous amount in the last 6 or 7 weeks to undermine any sense that she is a leader, frankly, and doing the bare minimum this morning is not going to be enough to turn that round very quickly, I would think.
Professor Brooks, but do you think this is fair for her? I mean, to what extent should she be held responsible for these incidents? And the words coming from the people who have been affected by these incidents have been very harsh. They called her cowardly, inhumane, murderer, and some other people calling her with blood on her hands. Aren't people overreacting a little bit as well?
Well, there's a lot of strong emotions that people will have, and prime ministers, whoever they are, will be subject to a lot of comments, both fair and unfair. I think that no prime minister can promise that no attack can happen on people, but it's without any question that there is a real divisiveness in the country. I think that whatever one's views are on whether Britain should remain in the European Union, I think that the referendum campaign and how that was conducted was very fractious, and it brought division where there had not been. And I think that the country hasn't quite healed from that moment. And I think that it only, in some sense, got worse during the election campaign. Often we hear about extremists being only from one background and not others. It's fed into this narrative of dividing communities against each other that has, and trying to crack down more on the extreme speech of, say, extremist Islamic preachers, and not extreme right-wing hate speech in the same way, or at least not giving it the same emphasis. And I think that some of this is coming back to haunt her. Someone who saw herself as a very strong Home Secretary over many years, actually her record as Home Secretary is now coming to bite her, come back to harm her, now that she's Prime Minister.
Yeah, well, we were just seeing footage of people demonstrating on the streets of London calling for her resign. Dr. Finn, how do you think her low ranking is going to affect her chances of getting support from other political parties such as the DUP in order for her to govern?
Well, I think the DUP has its own reasons to support her. It has its own reasons to support the Conservatives. It wants to wield greater influence, obviously, in the UK and in Northern Ireland as a whole. It wants power. So I think, insofar as that's the case, I don't think it'll make a huge deal of difference to that. On the other hand, I think the knock-on effect of her crisis of leadership within the Conservative Party is significant. You know, the fact that after the election she very quickly moved to try to stick out an idea that there was a deal in place with the DUP, it transpired that there wasn't, was partly just to try and offset a coup within the Conservative Party. There are many Conservative MPs, notwithstanding the 1922 committee's meeting last week, who want Theresa May gone as fast as humanly possible. And I think these continual crises of leadership in respect to Grenfell, in respect potentially this morning, we'll have to see how that plays out, will damage it still further with those Conservative MPs. So I think a bigger issue, to be honest, than the DUP, than making an arrangement with them, is simply the arrangement she has to keep making with her own backbenchers, who've seen her fail spectacularly in an election campaign in the past few weeks, and seen her essentially collapse as a brand in British politics. I think that's a bigger problem. I think in the medium term that's an insurmountable problem. I think that just means there's a question of time before she disappears. It doesn't necessarily mean the Conservative Party will fall from government, but I do think the days are numbered for Theresa May. It's just a question of when it ends.
Professor Brooks, do you share Dr. Finn's point of view here? How long do you think she's going to stay in power, and will the party in power be jeopardized?
I entirely agree with those remarks. I think Theresa May made the campaign quite literally all about her. Those who received the Conservative Party's election materials, the Conservative Party logo was very hard to find. Theresa May's name was on the front and throughout. Who people's local candidate was often marginalized. And it was a victory, a landslide victory, that Theresa May's team thought she was going to win, and she wanted to own it, so to claim the full credit. But of course, that's not what happened. And of course, in making it all about her, when expectations were not met and fell far short, there's only one person who can get the blame for that, and that is her. I think it is a matter of time before she is out. I suspect it will be before the end of the year. I think she'll be lucky to make it to the party conferences this autumn.
Well, at this moment, we are seeing Brexit negotiations officially underway. Dr. Finn, will her damaged standing affect the negotiations, and in which way, if yes?
I think it will affect it at a domestic level. I'm not sure that it makes a huge deal of difference in relation to the actual negotiations themselves, because I think ultimately the European negotiators, the European partners, have been frustrated now for a year that essentially it has been a year since the referendum almost, and it's only now that negotiations have begun, and largely that's attributable to various political decisions on behalf of the British, including this election. So whilst I think the Europeans are frustrated with that, I also think the Europeans have known their negotiating position for a very long time. So I don't think it'll affect that so much. What I think it will affect is her ability to command any sort of mandate for a particular kind of Brexit in the House of Commons. I don't think the election did speak clearly to any particular view on Brexit from the electorate. I think the election was about many more things than that. But it's monumentally weakened her politically, which inevitably means that actors within Parliament, such as our own Chancellor Philip Hammond, who are known to be more sympathetic to quote-unquote softer Brexit, are strengthened, and that effectively means that she is weaker at home. So it does mean that the kind of rhetoric that she was coming out with only 7 or 8 weeks ago about a hard Brexit, about the no deal is better than a bad deal, it's not clear that she'll be able to pursue any of that now. And the ambiguity of the arrangement with the DUP, the need for some clarification on a soft border with Ireland, etc., it just is, I don't think it will change the negotiations from the European point of view, but I think it will change them from the British point of view domestically, and I think it changes fundamentally the kind of character of any kind of Brexit the British government is trying to pursue.
Yeah, finally, before we go, Professor Brooks, what's your take on this?
Well, I think to some degree I agree with that, though I'd be a bit, perhaps even more critical. I think that with the European partners, the decision of the British public to leave the European Union has already been made, and the general election doesn't really affect that as such. But it's also the case that Theresa May is not getting a majority in Parliament has meant that whatever plan she had is not genuinely workable. And it's also the case that even as late as Friday, the government had still not sent its original position papers to its negotiating partners for this morning's meeting. That is to say, the general outline of what Britain wanted out of negotiations was not set out even in outline. Less than 1 working day before the negotiations start. Right. And this suggests to me very much this is a government that's not only lost its authority at home, but it's lost it abroad as well.
Well, they definitely had a lot of things in their hands to do. Well, many thanks, Professor Thom Brooks, Dean of the Durham Law School at Durham University, and Dr. Mike Finn, Deputy Head of the School for Cross-Faculty Studies at the University of Warwick. And my first point here, the fallout from the incidents this past week in which 79 were presumed dead after the fire in West London and the 4th terrorist attack in the UK this year could be much greater than at first appeared. With the personal attacks on Theresa May having been stepped up, rightly or wrongly, it doesn't really matter, then politicians from other parties such as the DUP are less likely to want to form an alliance with a weak Prime Minister, while if the Conservative Party is finally forced into going to the country for yet another election, that is bound to affect the Brexit negotiations, especially if there is a change of power, a change of party in power. This is turning out to be not just an annus horribilis for the Conservative Party, but a challenging time for the UK as a whole. What is clear is that there is likely to be a lot more fallout from these seemingly unrelated incidents.